much, Martin, for the invitation and for all of you for being here. It's a real privilege for me to be speaking to you today, especially because it's a very interdisciplinary audience, so I'm excited about that. My talk is titled Revealing General Principles Underlying Proactive Vision and Memory. And at the end of the day, I'm trying to understand visual experiences, and that is because my experience is very visual. Even if I close my eyes, I have a very strong visual imagery. I have very strong visual experiences, even in the absence of a physical stimulus. So I'd say right now I'm aware of my visual surroundings. I see you guys. But also later when I recall this talk, I have a phenomenological experience of giving this talk. So there's a certain, on the phenomenological level, there's something shared between me giving this talk and me recalling this talk. And I find that very interesting. And I'm trying to figure out ways, first of all, how to quantify what is shared across these kind of multiple instances on the subjective experience level, but also on the data level. So eye tracking data, on neural data, and so on. And that's what I call the general principles. I think the upcoming example will make this clearer. So just imagine you're visiting Washington, D.C. This is in March, cherry blossom season. That's where I did my postdoc. And you're there with a friend of yours. So this is the Jefferson Memorial. Some of you may recognize it. But it turns out that you are into architecture and your friend is a nature lover. So probably you're going to sample very different elements of that very same, let's call it a scene of that environment, right? So if I ask you later to recall your experiences of Washington, D.C., what are you going to recall? Probably not the same thing, first of all. And secondly, not everything in a one-shot fashion. You're probably going to recall what was relevant to you in that moment. And that's probably also going to be reflected in what you're telling me about your experiences there, right? So for me, this makes multiple important points, actually. So first of all, there's a very tight link between the behavior we express in a moment, in an environment, and later recall. So we can learn something from the behavior in a moment about what people will remember later. But this link between actions and memories is even more intimate than we often think, because even during recall, the eyes move. And it turns out that these eye movements are indicative of recall content. So even just from eye tracking data, you can infer to a degree what people are talking about. And I find that very interesting. And that's already really what I mean by a general principle. It's just a pattern in data that reoccurs over a range of tasks, in this case, kind of recall, visual perception, and imagery tasks. But we see such principles not only on the behavioral level, but also on the physiological level or the brain activity level. And I just want to, kind of as a preface, for me, this boundary between behavior and physiology is a very blurry one. In general, many boundaries between concepts for me, the more I work on them, the blurrier the boundary becomes. So let's say grasping, most people would say, is a behavior. Eye movements, there are already a few people who say, are eye movements a behavior, Martin?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I have a review right now for one of my papers who argues against that, who says eye movements are physiological and not behavioral. But that, for me, is already, it shows the point that the boundary is blurry. So eye movements are their behavior while you don't actually interact with the environment outside a social contact, where you just sample. But then, if that's a behavior, is pupil size changes a behavior? Is my heart pumping a behavior? Where is that boundary between physiology and behavior? The point is that I'm looking at just measures, what we call behavioral measures and physiological measures, what generalizes across multiple tasks, and then try to link them to the experiences that are shared across these tasks. And I hope by doing that, kind of to see them as all parts of one. I'm trying to come up with, first of all, actually, I'm trying to develop the approach to come up with concepts that describe this blurriness and this relationship between these concepts in a different way than we have right now, not in kind of foxy way, yeah?
Can I ask, what is physiology? And are you talking about physiology as like a computational substrate and behavior as an outcome of the substrate?
Yeah, so you could say behavior is physiology in motion. That's kind of a one-liner, right? But the physiology for me is the anatomy of the system. It's the actual biological substrate. Okay. And then the behavior is if you want to call it, the output of that system. But again, where do you draw the boundary between the physiological substrate and the movement of that physiological substrate? It's a bit of we do that on a conceptual level, we draw a boundary, but for me, these things are blurry. And many of the concepts that we use in psychology in general, the perception, memory, and so on, they're all, I see many blurry boundaries. And so much of my work is, first of all, thinking about how to reconceptualize that space, and then also developing just empirical approaches that allow you to test these new concepts. And it will become clearer when I go into the perspective article, I believe. But that's kind of a mission statement here, and I use usually eye tracking as the behavior of choice because it's relatively affordable and easy to acquire, and it's a frequent exploration behavior we express. I use neuroimaging, such as fMRI and MEG, to get at this, what we call physiological level. Shared experiences, I mean, that's a tricky one, right? We cannot measure the experiences, ask people to report them, so at least we can kind of learn something about these experiences by asking people. And so then really the core empirical approach is to test for generalization across of these patterns in these data types across different tasks, what is shared, for example, between me giving this talk and recalling this talk, and also what is shared on the data level. So, and what generalizes across these data types. And in order to do that, I'm really pursuing, most recently, really these naturalistic multitask studies in the context of visual perception, imagery, and recall. And this brings me to this outline of the talk. The first part is this kind of conceptual rethinking that I want to propose. It goes back to the perspective article that Martin mentioned. I want to briefly mention a few open source community tools I'm developing for joint studies of brain activity and behavior, because in an MRI scanner, it's not trivial to measure human behavior. So how do we even do that? So I'm developing tools to study more a kind of richer behavior in the scanner. And then lastly, I want to just showcase one study of my postdoc that was recently, it's about to come out, to kind of showcase how I try to bring these things together. So first of all, the conceptual rethinking. The article is called Centering Cognitive Neuroscience on Task Demands and Generalization, and we wrote this during my postdoc, and by we I mean these amazing people. I want to point out Chris Baker particularly, who was my postdoc advisor. And before I go into this, I just want to see how many cognitive neuroscience, who of you identifies as a cognitive neuroscientist? Just wondering. Can you give me a definition of what that is?
Psychology with brains.
That's a good one, yes, exactly. Yeah, so for me, exactly, so I agree with that already. So that's already, right, we're trying to come up with a theory or a model that bridges these levels, right? That's exactly the kind of, want to cross that boundary somehow. I think that's actually really at the essence of what cognitive neuroscience is to me too. And when we look at how do we currently do cognitive neuroscience, in most of the cases, this is, I'm making up that number, but I would say this is more than 90% of the studies in the field, including many of mine. But here's a standard experimental approach. We start with a concept of interest, like working memory, right? Many of us have a huge interest in working memory, me included. So we start with a concept of interest, and you pick a task that you think tests this concept, like an NBAC task. We often call it a working memory task. The task is named after the concept that we assume that it tests. And then we make a behavioral and neural observation. And this is often called in the literature the outside-in approach, because you go from the outside, from the concept level into the data. You start with a theory and you test it in data. And that, of course, has a lot of strengths. For example, it's really hypothesis-driven, right? You have a theory, you design your task to kind of disentangle certain factors, and you can later say, it's this factor and not that factor that explains my data. And that's powerful. But if we look at what kind of evidence this task also produces, this paradigm really, it's the following. This is a meta study score of 1,800 studies on attention. So these are 1,800 studies that tested the concept of attention, and that's the brain activity associated across those 1,800 studies. If we compare these to these 1,100 studies on working memory, or these 200 studies on mental imagery, they all look extremely similar to me. And in fact, if you can plug in many, many other concepts that we consider distinct, but if we look at the empirical evidence for their distinction, it's actually very little, to a degree where you could shuffle the labels, you could shuffle these underlying studies and you would not change these maps. That's how similar they are. And that is not necessarily the kind of evidence that we want, at least empirically, for the dissociation between these concepts. And for me, at least, even theoretically, I don't understand, for example, how we can have visual imagery without working memory, or how to conceptualize working memory fully independent of attention. This is already showing that in order to define one of those concepts, you also need to define the others, right? And that they're somewhat even overlapping. And so one interpretation here, of course, is that, and that's been put forward many times, is that, well, maybe the same biological substrate supports all of these cognitive functions. That's a valid interpretation of these data, I think. But there's another interpretation, and that is that if we look at the tasks that we ask people to do, for example, prepare to attend to a stimulus before it's shown, hold a stimulus in mind over a delay period, imagine a stimulus without it being present, and usually look at visual stimuli, click a button, line a scanner, stuff like that. There's a lot of things that are actually shared across these experiments, what we would call maybe task demands. And maybe those task demands are actually the main driver of that overlap, and even the distinction and overlap across these studies. So I think task demands actually finding a principled way of understanding what task demands are and how to measure their effects, I think actually allows us to get two concepts that naturally go across these different separate concepts that are traditionally studied with highly specialized tasks. Does this already, does this provoke anybody or fascinate anybody? By the way, just interrupt me if you have a question. I would really love to have a discussion if you have questions or so. Yes?
Is actually anybody still looking at task versus other task studies like this? Like, I understand there are these data sets with thousands of working memory tasks, and you contrast them against not working memory tasks. But is actually anybody still looking at that? I'd be surprised.
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody is really doing that anymore.
Yeah, I think people do. I mean, Russ Poldrick, for example, they have like huge task batteries and so on, and looking at what. But here's the issue: these tasks are already all heavily inspired by the concept you set out to study. Some of them are hyper-tuned over decades to test a very specific form of attention. And the kind of data that you produce is not a data set. It's so specific that it's hard to test whether the phenomenon that you're studying is actually general beyond that task. It's such a specific task that it's hard to, that the data set that you create does not allow you to test whether the phenomenon is general. You just show that you learn something about, let's say, attention in that task, and you write, everyone writes the paper, of course, as if it was general. We write a paper about attention, not about attention for Gabors at 2-degree visual angle compensation. You want to learn something about attention, right? But that's a form of generalization that happens on the level of the concept, not on the level of the data. And that's what I'm arguing is actually risky to a degree, because it leads to something like this, where many people run the same experiment, but then one person decides to write an imagery paper, and another one calls it working memory, and another one calls it attention, and they end up at different meta-level scores and different reviews in different conferences. And they, at least I think if I look at cognitive neuroscience as a field, I see a field that is quite fragmented and actually fragments more over time. So we have, for example, now we have more concepts for memory than ever before, not fewer. And in many other disciplines, you would say that scientific advance is coming up with concepts that explain more phenomena. A more general parsimonious concept is a form of scientific advance. But in our field, that's a controversial statement, I understand, but let's provoke you a little bit. But I think actually what happens is that that now we have many more concepts than we started off with. And that's in a way a direction that is almost counterintuitive. We want concepts that are parsimonious. That's my argument. So I believe that for many of these concepts, there are, so at least what we see is that many putatively distinct mental processes engage overlapping neural substrates. That's the less controversial point. I think that for many of these concepts, there's no at least strict empirical or even theoretical separation. Again, I don't exactly know how to have imagery without working memory. And I think that by looking at the actual experiment, the task demands of our experiments and how they are shared across tasks, we can learn how these task demands mutually constrain neural activity, behavior, and also maybe the experience of the participant. That's the proposal. And in a way, the proposal is actually not in that sense new. I think the task demand phrasing is new, but the criticism about the psychological concept is very old. There are many, many papers that I would like to point you to that have made very similar points, that have kind of criticized this, at least they put forward a certain skepticism towards this traditional psychological taxonomy of where many concepts like cognition and perception are very, very old. They predate any physiological measurement by many hundreds of years, thousands of years sometimes. The concept of cognition is super old. And I, at least, growing up into the field, I never fully understood, for example, where perception ends in the brain and where cognition starts. It was always somehow mixed. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah, so exactly. So at least I always see that it does resonate with few people. I had that feeling too, at least. I never fully understood where that separation is. The ideas can be empirically derived new parsimonious concepts from the data. And indeed, there is actually a proposal by multiple people, but the most prominent person here is Georgi Bouchaki from NYU. And he proposed what they call the inside-out approach, where you actually don't start off with the theory, with the concept, but you start off, you prioritize the neural substrate. So you plug in an electrode, for example, in the hippocampus, and you just record what's there. You just record the data. And then you look for repeatable patterns in these data. What is it that repeats? And that you would call a pattern. Any signature that repeats on any time scale, that's a pattern. And then you look at what is the, in this case, animal doing while you observe that pattern. For example, there's a ripple in the hippocampus. What is the animal doing in this moment? Oh, it's sniffing, it's rearing, it's whatever, anything. And that's how you conceptualize after the fact. That's how you find an explanation. You derive a concept empirically from the data. That's the proposal, at least. And I like that approach. I like the idea of empirically deriving a concept. But the problem is, for me at least, is that it's extremely unconstrained. So first of all, what's the pattern you're looking for? And also, what environmental and behavioral factors do you correlate with that pattern? There is literally an infinite number of variables that you could measure about the environment and about the behavior. So how do you do that mapping? And how do you know that if you found a mapping, that it's a unique mapping, there's no other solution that would also map? So that's a problem here, I think. And even bigger, neither one of those approaches are inherently testing whether the results generalize across, like on the level of the data, across tasks, for example. And I would argue that that's a prerequisite for generalization to the real world. If a pattern is only present for Gabor's at 2 degrees visual angle from the fovea, then it's exclusively there and in no other task. Do we really know that we're learning something general about, let's say, attention in the supermarket? I think that this across-task generalization is, in a way, it maximizes the chance of finding patterns that actually do generalize to the real world. And again, I made that point already, that I think what happens often, I've done that too, I think all of us have done that, is that we generalize on the level of the concept. Let's say in the discussion section of our paper, we cite other papers, for example, that studied attention. And then we conclude that the phenomenon is general, because this study showed attention for faces, the effect of attention for faces, and this study showed effect of attention for houses, for example. And then you say, okay, that is general. But again, if there is there's a certain arbitrariness in how people write their papers, even though they run the same experiment, then this generalization on the level of the concept is not the right level. We should generalize on the level of the data. Did that make sense? There's a few. So here's the proposal. What do we actually do? That's in a way the problem, but what do we actually do? Here's the proposal. Instead of running these very specialized tasks that are designed to disentangle individual factors, I think what we're actually after, at least in this kind of research program, what we're after is understanding the interaction between these factors and describing these interactions. For example, if I change the goal of the agent, of the participant, then different stimulus features are relevant to achieve that goal. And certain different behaviors are being expressed. And so understanding these interactions between the goals, the stimuli, and the behaviors requires a multitask study where you actually vary these things and create a data set that combines variability that you want to explain with control, which is the factors that you vary. So in the Bouchaki case, for example, the inside-out approach, where moving that to humans, it would be, let's say, college students walking around on campus. You don't know what to track and so on. Here, by varying instructions and stimuli, for example, together, you have control over what you're varying, and you can still create a data set that has variability, and you understand that interaction between these factors. So, for example, you can already, just based on the tasks alone, understand, based on my stimuli, actions, instructions, how similar are they. And you can do this for the neural activity too. So let's say this is fake data, but let's imagine that's parietal cortex activity. You can look across multiple tasks, which tasks are actually similar to parietal cortex activity, or on our eye tracking level, for example, or any whatever, skin conductance level. Which tasks are similar on the levels of our data? And we can find that, right, through simple clustering analyses, for example. It's like, oh, these tasks are similar and these other tasks are not similar. You can also test which patterns generalize across these different modalities, again, blurring that boundary. So you can come up with, for example, with PCA or something, you can you can find patterns that generalize across these different data types. And you can also specifically test for cross-task generalization and link those generalizable patterns back to what you varied. And that's how you would make sense of them. So you, in a way, it combines the strengths of these other two approaches, because you need to have a theory, you need to pick those components that you vary. It's not just complete random or complete naturalistic. You have to have a theory. If you want to say something about visual stimuli, you better have some visual stimuli. So you have to have a research question and a theory to begin with, but you're not constraining the kinds of patterns you find and the kinds of concepts that you may derive a priori. You don't, that concept doesn't come first. You're still creating a data set that allows to empirically derive something new.
You're still constraining the instructions, actions, and stimuli, right?
Exactly. So that's how you add your research question at the end of the day, right? Yeah. But you don't start off with a single concept and then test that one concept in this kind of one-way street. You create a data set, for example, where you then want to understand how instructions and stimuli interact on the level of your eye tracking data, for example, or on the level of your neural activity level. And you can even test, by specifically testing for generalization, you can test where those two data types converge, what kinds of patterns are present in both of those data types. That's the idea. And those are the patterns that, first of all, they generalize across tasks already, so the chance of them generalizing to the real world higher, I would say. And secondly, it's inherently concepts that also generalize across these data domains. It's really getting at blurring these boundaries, getting a generalizable concept that is also general across data.
But then if you give this to any cognitive neuroscientist these days, they will use, I don't know, a post-occurring task and a visual search task or something like that.
Exactly. That already exists. Yeah. So there's neuroscience, for example.
I'm saying like that's going to constrain your generalizability again, right? Because they're coming from very small world traditions.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point I wanted to make with Thomas as well earlier. So if you the kinds of data that is out there right now, with the kind of generated with the standard approach of like starting with a concept and then acquiring your data, these data are not ideal to test to find a concept, really. I think they are also inherently constrained by the existing theory, and you will necessarily find that those theories explain the data well, because the theory came first. The data is a function of that existing theory. You will, of course, there's almost a certain circularity in there. You start with a theory, you hyper-tuned your task to test that specific theory, and then you end up finding that theory explains your data well. Or if it doesn't, what happens often is that you then split up the concept. Oh, it's not one form of attention, it's 2 types of attention, 5 types of attention. So it's an approach, I think, that can never go beyond the concepts that it started off with, other than fragmenting them. That's one of the very general points, right? It goes across fields, even across beyond what I'm doing. It's a very general point, and I think that's to me at least, it's a very profound point, and a very important point that for me at least really made me rethink, it's going away from these, that's where I come from traditionally, like from very kind of designing an experiment to disentangle factors and so on. But that paradigm, if you go to more naturalistic tasks, the problem is that it fails. Empirically speaking, it fails. There's a nice paper by Yuri Hasson, for example, called Keep It Real, that makes that exact argument, that going from that very simplistic, fine-tuned task to more complex and naturalistic conditions, these models don't actually, empirically speaking, have worked. That paradigm hasn't worked. Let's say most models of V1 that we have, they may explain 80% of variance as long as there are no eye movements. As soon as you throw in eye movements, these models drop to like, what, 10% variance explained. And that is already something that really dampens that generalization, right, to the real world even, where all of these factors are inherently correlated. Let's say plants are typically green. Most plants that we encounter are green. So if we want to walk around in the real world and try to disentangle the greenness from plantness, of course there are some plastic objects and stuff, but if you change the color of a plant, you may not actually experience it as a plant anymore. So many of these factors that we think of confounds, they are actually, I think, diagnostic features of even the higher level category that we're interested in. So I think the proposal here is that with this kind of natural, first of all, going more naturalistic. So, for example, using natural scenes instead of composers, movies instead of natural scenes. That's something that I'm trying to do. Kind of adding more and more naturalistic stimuli and more variability into my data, but then still trying to explain that variability. That's in itself is a challenge. But then also not just more naturalistic, but also going across these multiple tasks, for example, by varying the instructions. So one study that I'm running right now is, for example, people watching movies, but under multiple instructions. You could imagine that someone watching a movie and then recalling the movie is giving you a certain brain activity and certain eye tracking. But if you ask, watch this movie and memorize as much as possible of it, then that will probably change their neural activity and the behavior and what they later recall. So that instruction has a huge effect on the experience of the movie and what they later remember. So that's the kind of study that I'm talking about, that I'm running. Varying stimuli and instructions together. And again, you will find ideally concepts that naturally generalize across tasks and data modalities with this approach. Do you have any? Yeah, great.
Yeah, you just said you of course, you draw your conclusions from the patterns you find. Is that some sort of theory, and what happens to your theory? Does it somewhere inspire your approach?
Yeah, so it's essentially, here's the kind of circle of life scheme. It's really, you start off with, so the theory, in my opinion, is it has to be the starting point and the end point of any scientific endeavor. That's what we're after. That's the advance, if you advance the theory. So you have to have first of all, you have to have a research question at the very least. And you have to articulate that research question in an empirically testable way. And that gives you the first stage here, this kind of multitask study. I'm varying, for example, the instructions and stimuli together. If you combine that with rich data, where you actually are sensitive to not just a neural measure or so, but actually multiple measures, you then can go across these boundaries too. And you go across these boundaries of tasks and modalities by specifically testing for generalization. So you find patterns that are general or unique, but you can describe what they mean to the participant. You know what you varied. So you can say, well, this generalizable pattern is, let's say, the presence of faces, or it reflects the presence of faces, or it reflects the perception of a certain orientation or something. And then that informs your theory in the next step. So essentially you go in a one-way street, but you go in a circle.
So somehow on a higher level and with much more complexity, because you have these different tasks and stimuli, but you do the same. Your theory constrains what you look at. And the
theory has to, it is the starting point. Yeah. So it's not, what I'm proposing here is not theory-free by any means. theories, again, it's the most important thing. You start with a theory and you end with a theory, hopefully. But you do not isolate, you don't limit yourself to an individual concept that you're mapping onto a, let's say, a neural activity or a behavior. And you can come up with concepts that explain your data, just like in the Bouchaki approach, that explain a lot of data, but you didn't start off with these concepts. You found them, you empirically derived them from the data. So it's really a merger of those two original approaches. That's the idea. And I think part of this, there's actually a lot more in this article. Part of this is also what kinds of questions do we ask even? For example, a classical question is like, what's the function of V1? What's the function of the hippocampus? Well, can anyone give me an answer? What's the function of V1?
Detecting edges.
For example, edge detection.
There's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them, exactly. That's it. You already made the point that I wanted to make too. There is not a single function. If I ask you what's the general function of my index finger when I grasp, swim, wave at you, give me a single function of my index finger in all of these three tasks.
Moving, indexing.
Yeah, moving, exactly. Moving or maybe like, exactly. So, but the problem with that is the definition of function is so inspecific that it applies to literally anybody or any part of my body. So either you lose specificity, then it's general, but then it's so general that it applies to every part of my body, or it's so specific that it's, and what Thomas said, it's task specific. Like the functions are really only definable within the context of a task.
But that doesn't mean that my finger and my toe have the same functions, right?
Exactly, absolutely. So of course they still contribute different things to task performance, but it's still, if you ask, for example, what's the function of V1, and you run an experiment and you find an answer, it's tempting to conclude, and this has happened in the field, I think, it's tempting to conclude that we now know the function of V1. Let's say you lose the hippocampus and you have trouble remembering. A common inference is that the function of the hippocampus is memory, right? But let's say if I lose my right eye, I lose stereopsis. That doesn't mean that the function of my right eye was stereopsis. It means that it contributed something important, right? Or let's say in a car example, right? If you take out the pedal, it doesn't drive anymore. It doesn't mean that the function of driving was localizable to the pedal. But actually in our field, we often make that inference about lesion studies, which are the strongest evidence that we have for localization of function. But again, if I lose my right eye, I don't have stereopsis anymore. It doesn't mean that stereopsis was localizable. But the point is that to run this framework efficiently, I think we also need to reframe a little bit how we phrase the question. For example, asking about the contributions of a brain area to task performance doesn't lead you down that route of saying, now I understood what the function is. It allows you to, it at least leave space for a multiplicity of answers. And I think that's actually more in line with at least how I understand brain function right now, with kind of distributed processes where V1 in congenitally blind people is wonderfully active, and you can decode all sorts of stuff from V1, even in people born without vision. So there is certainly multiplicity of functions. In this framework and in this paper, there are a lot of these kinds of considerations, what the kind of question is that we should be asking. That's I'm not claiming to know that, but there's a few considerations in here in the paper. Might be interesting. Are there any questions about, or any other points about this?
I don't know how long there is going to be left. That's the thing.
At the end of the day, this is the most important thing for me.
Okay. So I'm very new in the field, and we always thought that the people like Posner 40 years ago had the same perspective, that we want to do something bigger and generalizable, but we just didn't have the tools, both computation and recording, to show significant. So I don't know what has changed in your perspective, that now we can do bigger stuff because we still have the same machines and mostly relying on the same computation.
Yeah, so from an experimental point of view, running a multitask study is challenging, right? Because so far already, just funding a single study is a single task study is a lot. So how would you scale that up? That, for example, has changed. That acquiring data has become much cheaper than it used to be. They're also finding these patterns that you didn't start off with. You don't know what you're looking for. You're not looking for a specific event-related potential or something in a task. You don't exactly know what you're looking for. And that, of course, has to do with machine learning, where you can find in a kind of data-driven way patterns that are general. So I think on an analytical level, but also on the data acquisition level, we have come a long way, even in the past 10 years. The past 10 years were insane in terms of number of neurons recorded, for example, and the machine learning tools that we developed, AI tools to develop that make sense of complex data. So, and then also I think that a part of the story is also a slight dissatisfaction with the status quo of the field that has grown over the past 10 or 20 years. There are a lot of people who, not everybody, but there are a lot of people, biased by my opinions, I get a lot of opinions back where people are a little bit frustrated with the progress, kind of the theoretical progress of the field. We're like, what are we doing? Where is this going? A lot of people ask, where is this going? What are we actually doing? And I think that dissatisfaction has also grown. So in that sense, the pressure is growing. That makes this possible now. Yeah.
If I may, I appreciate the approach of like not being so constrained based on the concept that you define on how you look at the data, but in practice that sounds a little bit like a post hoc explanation of the data that you get. How do you differentiate the two?
Yeah, I mean the post hoc thing is first of all you start with a theory that you do test, right? And you inform that theory, and you can then test specific theories in a loop. You can refine your theory more and more. The kind of post hoc explanation of data, I don't think in that sense that in itself is not a problem. I think it's not a problem to explain phenomena that you observe, to come up with an explanation of that. That's not a. The issue is if people, and that has happened too, the issue is not that. The issue is if people come up with a post hoc explanation and then call it a prediction that they've had before. That's the problem. If you come up with a post hoc explanation, that's completely fine as long as you label it as such, I think.
Do you have an example where, can you give an example of, have you done this?
Yeah, I'm doing this right now. So there's a lot of things that I'm even learning about how to vary instructions. It's actually non-trivial because it turns out a lot of participants don't read instructions very well. I learn a lot about how to run these studies. So I'm trying to kind of approach the mountain at least. I'm trying to take these steps there and how to design a study that has I ran a lot of pilots where the instructions, for example, and just the way you deliver the instruction has a huge effect. And we're trying to understand that. In terms of the concept in general, the concept I find most interesting is not something that I came up with, but if you think of the concept of affordances, like the Gibson idea, I find that's an interesting idea for many reasons. One of them is that, at least the way we think about affordances nowadays, is that they're neither affordances, essentially, for those who don't know, it's the idea that we perceive action possibilities, or our perception is an experience of action possibilities. So how do we interact with the environment? And in a way, these affordances, how I interact with something, the affordance of a river, for example, depends on whether I can swim or not. So it's neither a property of the world nor of me. It's something that describes that interaction directly. It's not a box and arrow, me and the environment, and like action perception loops. It's a way of conceptualizing the whole problem that directly describes the interaction. And at least that's something that I find very stimulating. That's something that I find very interesting, and I think we need more of such concepts. That philosophy of mind, you would call it maybe a transjective object that really goes across these boundaries. At least that's the kind of stuff that I would be after. What I find most interesting. And imagine also a machine, for example, that is built directly based on such principles. For example, I find that interesting.
So what I've been kind of thinking about during this, during your talk, has been the hippocampus, which is like, I think, a famous example of, we can find correlations of location, also time, oh, also smell, oh, also, you know, visual imagery, dot, dot, dot.
Yeah.
And we've kind of expanded these sort of local tests to something much more general. And I'm working on navigation, so I'm working on like kind of like, there's the classic literature that are, you know, pulling apart the hippocampus versus the striatum.
Yeah.
Or, you know, map-based versus response-based
Mark-based
navigation.
versus geometry and so on.
Yeah, I wonder to what because there's also the way of approaching multiplicity of function or degeneracy would also be silencing pathways.
Yeah.
So to look at, you know, a hippocampus silenced or a striatum silenced sort of pathway, look at the differences between these. And I feel like that's a counterpart to this, to your approach, that I think could work in an opposite way of approaching degeneracy.
Yeah. No, actually, are you talking about when you say silencing, you mean perturbation? Is that true?
No, there's I guess ways of silencing. I'm not too familiar with like the neuroscience like tools. Yeah. I forget this. I guess there's different ways of like silencing parts of the brain, but also like silencing like senses too, like, you know, silencing the vision sense, silencing the vestibular sense, looking at different ways that you can kind of and I think it's a different approach to looking at degeneracy. It's not generalizable. This is much more specific.
Yeah.
But I think it's the mirror image.
So in general, I don't have in any way a problem with the traditional approach in that sense, and also kind of disentangling factors and designing a task carefully and so on. I think it's beautiful and it has to be done. What it's essentially the argument of Yuri Hasson in this Keep It Real paper is that that should not be the starting point, because you do risk getting into local minima. Whereas if you start naturalistic and you define what the larger patterns are that are actually worth describing, those that generalize to the real world, then you can go in and become more specific. So that's the argument really, and that's I like that argument, and I would want to put that forward here too. So you start with the more complex, and you go into the simple rather than the other way around. It doesn't mean that one or the other is better or worse. It means right now I think there's a heavy emphasis on the simple. So, and people wanting to go more complex, in the field at least, there are all these models and theories, many of them fail. Empirically speaking, they don't actually explain a lot of data.
But work on naturalistic stimuli, more naturalistic tasks, all of this has been around for 20 years, right? Like, so that.
Yeah, but also the word naturalistic, what that means, varies a lot. So naturalistic used to be an image, like that was 20 years ago, a picture of a scene was naturalistic, and now it would be considered maybe very simple. And now, like, people call movies naturalistic, and then I think already now people start talking. Okay, movies are also not very naturalistic. VR is naturalistic, but the very definition of what we call naturalistic is moving with it's a moving target.
Okay, so whatever you're doing right now in terms of naturalistic will be in 5 years criticized by the next more naturalistic guy.
Hopefully, yeah, I hope so.
Okay, good.
So I hope there's a development towards more becoming more real world like.
I would say that this is a feedback loop between these two methods. I think the general to the specific is definitely one path, but you also don't know how to construct a general test if you don't know like a bag of specifics to start with.
Yeah, I agree. I don't wanna diss on the simple. It's very important. That just the proposal that I'm trying to make is in a way. The simple right now is the predominant framework, the individual tasks and so on. And so I think it has led us to, for example, a field that is extremely fragmented with a lot of concepts. And the field does in many areas struggle with convergence, where there's tons of work on how attention and working memory, how they interact and so on. But coming up with there are very few theories that are profoundly new. And I think part of that is because the approach of studying these concepts reifies them. The kind of one-way street of concept, specialized task, data does not create a data set where you can find something that's completely general. It's almost a paradox. Maybe just in the interest of time, the last 10 minutes, I just want to say that part of this also is I'm doing is tool development. So again, I'm using a lot of MRI, and MRI is not great to study behavior. So I do also develop these tools to study behavior in the scanner. One of them is what we call deep MRI. It's a framework for MR-based eye tracking without a camera. And it's co-developed with Markus Vrije and Christian Döller. And so here the idea is really that how do we study behavior in the scanner? Eye movements are the most frequent exploration behavior that we express. And if you look at the MR signal around the eyes when they move, you see there's a lot of structural change, right? You just see by eye that the eyes are moving, obviously. So what we did is we developed multiple tools. One of them is deep MRI, but multiple tools to get at those movements in the MRI image. And so in this case, it's a CNN that takes as input these eyeball voxels and decodes gaze position on the screen. So you can do eye tracking just based on the MR images themselves. And this works actually like a charm. So here's a camera and here's deep MRI for a single subject. But in the paper, there's 300 subjects, 5 scanners, 15 scanning protocols, and so on. There's a lot in there. But in Petrol is our approach. So completely for free, open source, online on GitHub. Here's a camera. The default is an iLink. An MR-compatible iLink costs 65,000 euros. So you really can, I think, replace, for many tasks at least, you could replace this really expensive hardware with deep MRI or with such a tool. And the cool thing here, I find, is that it even works in existing data. So you can do eye tracking in a data set acquired in the 90s without eye tracking. So you can ask, and that's what I'm doing a lot in my work now too, is I'm asking new questions using these existing data resources. That makes it, for me now as a young assistant professor, of course, also just a valuable tool kind of for students and so on to actually run projects that are quite complex, where you would never have the time to, for example, acquire a whole fMRI data set. But this tool works in existing data, and what I'm most excited about is these things that it can do that you cannot do with a camera, and that is, for example, eyes closed eye tracking. Because we're looking at the eye voxels themselves, the eyes don't need to be open. I mean, when the eyes move, you still have that structural change. So in the paper, we tested whether we can do eyes closed eye tracking. So here's one subject that moved the eyes up and down versus left and right, and just clicked a button, what they were doing. And then we color-coded the decoding output by that self-report, and it seems to work extremely well. This is a single subject example. Right now, we're running this on a much larger scale with eyes closed eye tracking that works really nicely. And so it means we can, for example, look at eye movement activity in the brain independent of visual confounds. We can we're analyzing a sleep data set, in sleep and added eye tracking, for example, where we look at eye movements across different sleep stages, for example. And also you can use it for patient groups where a camera cannot really be calibrated. For example, again, congenitally blind participants, you cannot really calibrate the data for them, the camera for them. Our model you can calibrate on sighted people and then decode from the patients. And so instead of listing more opportunities here, maybe you have some ideas how you would want to use this or something like this in your own work. There's maybe just a software that allows you to get rid of this expensive, maybe annoying piece of hardware. Maybe that's a thought to think about when you go back to your computer, like what part of software do I really dislike? And maybe you can actually replace it with software. And so this thing, deep MRI is fully open source and you can download it from GitHub. Do you have questions about deep MRI?
Oh, I was just wondering, so how, because now you mentioned that you can calibrate it on sighted people, so I was wondering how do people with closed eyes know that they make a 6-degree saccade up or down?
Yeah, so the training data would be that you do have a calibration screen, but let's say people look at the right and then they close their eyes for a little bit and then that's how you get training data. But actually, even if you calibrate it on just eyes open, then decode from eyes closed, it still works. It was, but it still works actually.
And that also works with these old papers that have eye movements in them, and you can still.
Many of them, yeah. As long as some of them, as long as the eyes are on the images, yes.
the temporal precision is the precision of the MRI, right?
No, it's actually higher than that. It's actually the temporal precision is actually higher than the MRI. And
Is it interpolating or is it interpolating?
No, it's because let's say imagine a MRI image, and while you acquire that image, the eyes move up and down.
Yeah.
Now imagine a MRI image where the eyes move left, right. There will be a smoothness introduced into the image that is either vertical or horizontal, and just based on that smoothness, the MRI is actually able to not the sequence of fixations, but you get a higher temporal resolution. You get time points in between, like while the image was acquired. You can say the eye moved from left to right during the image acquisition, or from top to bottom or something.
Like elastographic imaging or stuff like that.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So you get a higher temporal resolution than the imaging protocol. Yeah.
Would it be possible to apply that to other measures like EEG?
Yeah, so there are people who are working on this actually. So I'm not sure what the state of that is, but I saw one preprint that tried to do something very similar on EEG and MEG data, and I'm pretty sure that works. I mean, often you have the EOG electrode, right? But especially if you take these frontal channels on the EEG, I'm sure that's going to work. Yes, pretty sure. And also I was thinking about essentially anything that in MRI at least, anything that's a confound in MRI, like what we call a confound, breathing, heart rate, all of that stuff, it is a confound because it affects the data. And if it affects the data, you can decode it. So you could, I'm thinking about extending this way of analyzing data also to, for example, heart rate and breathing. For example, if you take here the veins, the mask of the veins, and decode breathing and heart rate, you could essentially, with the same pipeline, add more physiological measures. Yeah, so that the only problem I have is essentially personnel. I need people. So I don't really have the time to pursue it all, but definitely I see a lot of growth potential there too, also towards other data types and physiological measures, yeah.
And could you at the same time, because you said it, eliminate the confound also from the signal with your, I mean, you could use the signal, yes, and could you at the same time just eliminate your artifacts?
Yeah, so for the fMRI part, that's, I think you can, because the eye voxels are independent of, let's say, the brain voxels you're interested in. You have an independent region of interest. EEG, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could use some of the channels and then denoise other channels with it. I think that's possible too, but yeah, it becomes trickier because the signal is essentially everywhere. I take the position that eye movements are in most cases not actually a confound, but part of the mechanism under investigation.
That could be both.
Could be both, yeah. The confound really enters the stage right when during the interpretation, when you say this is activity related to memory encoding, and then if you have an eye movement difference, that's when it becomes a confound. But maybe the ways the eyes move are a part of memory encoding. So I'm thinking about actually, that's actually the last part of the. And I have 1 minute for this. So I'm running over that very quickly, but the point here is, first of all, it's again a study with Chris Baker, and it's going to come out soon. And it goes back to this idea of shared behaviors and shared brain activity, and the kind of phenomenon that the eyes move during recall, and also that brain activity is re-expressed during recall. And we just, in this very popular data set, these kind of neural reactivations were already well established. There are 20 papers on that data set, the the Sherlock Holmes movie watching data set. And we use these kind of MR-based eye tracking techniques to get the eye movement data for that data set. And so, and we also acquired actual camera-based eye tracking data, but the point is that we can, first of all, establish that this neural reactivation and the eye movements actually share many features. For example, they're specific to the individual movie event. They are robust across participants, and they're explained by the movie content. And so anyway, the point is that that neural reactivations and this gaze reinstatement phenomenon, they share a lot of features, a lot of properties. And so the idea is that's one piece of evidence that they are related. And then we also used again MR-based eye tracking here, hidden Markov model. The details are not very important, but the point is that a hidden Markov model trained on the eye voxels and segment the movie that people are watching in the scanner very nicely into meaningful events. So where people put the event boundary is also where the model puts an event boundary, just based on the eye voxels alone. So that's pretty cool. Again, when you think of, let's say, independent ROIs, you can use the eye voxels for event segmentation of that movie. And you can analyze your brain activity as a function of it, for example. But even cooler, I find, is that once this model is trained on movie viewing, it predicts what event people are recalling in the scanner. So later, just based on the eye voxels alone, you can infer which event they are talking about. And that I find very cool, and it speaks to this idea of something generalizes, right? I'm not exactly sure what it is, but there's something in these eye voxels that is event-specific, and that generalizes even to recall. And so that's also just an approach that I'm developing now further. And we also use deep MRI to look at the brain activity, which also overlaps across these tasks, viewing and recall, kind of as a form of test generalization. And I think the conclusion for me, the most important conclusion for me is that when you think of recall, a lot of people phrase it in a way that recall is a re-experience of the past, but I don't think that's actually true. The recall is an experience in its own right. You have a phenomenological experience at the instance of recall, and that experience is embodied. It has a physiological and a behavioral associated state. And if I have, on a phenomenological level, if there are things that are similar, then also it makes sense that on the data level there's things that are similar. That is in a way an explanation for these data. That was extremely brief. Thank you very much for your interest and for being here. And if you have any questions about that last part, then I will talk about it too. Thank you.